The Cold War was not always invisible. In one city, it became concrete. Berlin did not simply stand at the center of Europe after World War II. It stood at the center of a new kind of conflict, one where ideology hardened into walls, checkpoints, and armed borders drawn through streets, neighborhoods, and lives. In Berlin, the Cold War stopped being a theory and became a daily reality. What made the city unique was not its geography, but its symbolism. It represented everything the post-war world could not resolve peacefully. Former allies now governed opposing halves of the same city, each claiming legitimacy, each watching the other with suspicion. Berlin became a test case, not just for power but for endurance. At first, the division felt temporary. Zones were administrative, boundaries were porous, people crossed freely, believing that politics would eventually settle. Instead, the tension deepened. Surveillance increased, control tightened. What had been an inconvenience began to feel permanent. The city absorbed the pressure of the Cold War in a way no abstract doctrine ever could. Every street crossing became a political act. Every decision to stay or leave carried consequences. Families lived under opposing systems while standing only meters apart. The conflict was no longer distant or theoretical. It was immediate and personal. For the world watching, Berlin became a warning. If this division could happen here in a city once unified, rebuilt from ruins, it could happen anywhere. The Cold War was no longer a background condition. It had a face, a location, and a visible line separating two futures. This was the moment when the conflict became physical. And once walls replace words, history becomes difficult to reverse. What unfolded next was not sudden, but deliberate. The division of Berlin hardened step by step, each measure justified as temporary, necessary, or protective. Administrative controls became barriers. Barriers became checkpoints. Checkpoints became symbols of permanence. What had once been an open city slowly learned how to close itself. This process reshaped daily life in ways that were both mundane and profound. Routes people had walked for decades disappeared overnight. Jobs, schools, and families found themselves separated by decisions made far beyond their control. Ordinary routines became political statements simply by continuing. Staying meant one thing. Leaving meant another. Neutrality was no longer possible. Surveillance expanded quietly but relentlessly. Observation posts multiplied. Patrols became routine. The act of watching replaced the act of fighting. In Berlin, the Cold War expressed itself not through battles, but through constant visibility. To be seen was to be judged. To cross was to risk everything. The city became a laboratory for control. Identification papers, permits, and restrictions structured movement and opportunity. Ideology was no longer an abstract belief system. It dictated housing, employment, education, and freedom of travel. Berliners did not debate the Cold War, they lived inside it. This pressure produced a distinct psychological climate. Tension was not episodic, it was continuous. The awareness of division shaped behavior subtly. Conversations were measured. Trust became selective. The presence of authority was constant, even when invisible. Fear did not need to be enforced loudly. It was built into the environment. For the world beyond Berlin, these developments carried enormous symbolic weight. The city demonstrated what ideological conflict looked like when translated into physical space. It revealed the cost of unresolved rivalry, not in theory, but in human separation. Berlin was no longer just a city. It was evidence. As boundaries solidified, the possibility of reversal faded. Temporary measures became permanent realities. Each year of division normalized what had once been unthinkable. Children grew up knowing only one side. The idea of a unified city began to feel distant, almost abstract. This normalization was perhaps the most powerful effect of all. What begins as emergency eventually becomes routine. What is routine becomes accepted. Berlin showed how easily extraordinary restrictions could become ordinary life when justified by security and stability. The Cold War had found its most tangible form, not in weapons or speeches, but in concrete wire and silence. As the division became entrenched, Berlin began to function as two cities occupying the same physical space, but living in entirely different realities. The contrast was not always dramatic, but it was constant. Systems of governance, economic structures, and daily expectations diverged quietly. reinforcing the sense that reunification was no longer a question of time, but of possibility. Movement across the city grew increasingly restricted. What had once been casual crossings turned into regulated passages, each requiring permission, scrutiny, and compliance. The act of leaving one side for the other was no longer routine. It became a decision weighed with risk, consequence, and finality. For many, the choice was made for them. This environment altered relationships deeply. Families adapted to separation not because they accepted it, but because survival demanded it. Communication became cautious. Distance was measured not only in meters, but in ideology and consequence. Berliners learned to live with absence as a permanent condition. The presence of the border reshaped perception. Streets ended abruptly. Windows faced barriers instead of neighbors. Familiar landmarks were reinterpreted as limits rather than connections. The city itself appeared wounded, its geography marked by division that was visible, enforced, and inescapable. For authorities, control relied less on constant force and more on predictability. Routine became a method of discipline. Patrols followed schedules. Rules were applied consistently. The absence of randomness created an environment where resistance felt futile. Order replaced overt violence as the primary instrument of power. Yet beneath this order, tension persisted. The border did not eliminate uncertainty. It concentrated it. Every crossing attempt, every act of defiance, every escape carried the potential to trigger escalation. Berlin remained a flashpoint, not because conflict was constant, but because it was always possible. International attention intensified. The city became a stage upon which the Cold War was observed closely. Decisions made in Berlin were interpreted far beyond its limits. Each incident was analyzed for meaning, intent, and implication. The city carried weight disproportionate to its size because it embodied the conflict itself. This scrutiny reinforced caution. Local events were no longer local. They were signals. A single confrontation could ripple outward, testing the fragile balance between restraint and reaction. Berlin existed under the pressure of being watched, by its own authorities, by opposing systems, and by the world. And as years passed, this condition reshaped memory. Older generations remembered unity. Younger ones did not. What had once been temporary became history. The division of Berlin was no longer a pause in time. It was an era. The Cold War did not merely divide the city. It taught the city how to live divided. As the years passed, the division of Berlin ceased to feel provisional and began to shape identity itself. People no longer described where they lived simply as neighborhoods or districts. They described systems, sides. The city taught its residents to define themselves by the structure that governed their lives, even when that structure was imposed rather than chosen. This separation produced two parallel experiences of reality. Information flowed differently. Opportunities differed. Expectations were calibrated according to which side of the border one inhabited. What was normal on one side felt distant or inaccessible on the other, despite physical proximity. The Cold War had compressed ideological distance into a few meters of concrete and wire. Attempts to cross that distance carried enormous risk. Escapes were not acts of adventure. They were calculations made under pressure, often fueled by desperation rather than hope. Each attempt exposed the harsh logic of division. Movement itself had become a privilege regulated by ideology. The border did not merely stop people, it sorted them. For those tasked with enforcing the division, routine masked moral tension. Orders were executed calmly. Procedures were followed precisely. The system relied on normalization to function. Extraordinary authority was exercised through ordinary actions. Control did not require constant violence. Its power lay in predictability. The presence of the wall also reshaped how the world understood the Cold War. Abstract debates about ideology suddenly had a visual reference. The conflict could be photographed, mapped, and visited. Berlin became a lesson in permanence. It showed how quickly emergency measures could harden into lasting structures when justified by security and stability. Diplomacy around Berlin remained cautious. Every gesture was symbolic. Every change was scrutinized. The city was too sensitive for dramatic action. Stability mattered more than resolution. The wall stood not because it solved the conflict, but because it contained it. Its existence represented failure managed carefully rather than resolved openly. For Berliners, endurance became a skill. Life continued within constraints that were neither chosen nor easily challenged. The ability to adapt replaced the expectation of change. People built routines, futures, and identities inside a divided city because waiting for resolution offered no guarantee. This adaptation did not erase the sense of loss. It restructured it. Longing for unity became quieter, more private. Public life demanded compliance. Private memory preserved what division could not fully erase. The city learned to function with a wound that never healed. Berlin stood as proof that the Cold War was not only a geopolitical struggle, but a human one. Its consequences were measured not only in treaties and doctrines, but in daily compromises made by ordinary people. And as long as the wall remained, the city reminded the world of what unresolved conflict looks like when it is built into everyday life. As the division endured, Berlin began to reveal one of the Cold War's most unsettling truths. Separation, when sustained long enough, reshapes not only space, but expectation. What had once been experienced as an injustice slowly transformed into a framework within which life was planned. Hope adjusted itself downward, becoming cautious, conditional, and often private. The wall did not eliminate dissent, it redirected it. Resistance became subtle rather than confrontational. Small acts of defiance replaced open challenge. Humor, silence, and selective compliance emerged as survival strategies. The city learned that endurance often depended on invisibility rather than opposition. At the same time, the border imposed a constant moral tension. Every rule enforced carried an ethical weight, whether acknowledged or not. Authority depended on obedience, but obedience required normalization. The system functioned best when people stopped questioning it aloud. Acceptance did not mean agreement. It meant adaptation. Internationally, Berlin remained a symbol too sensitive to resolve decisively. Any dramatic change risked escalation far beyond the city itself. As a result, the wall was tolerated rather than defended, criticized rather than dismantled. Stability continued to outweigh justice. The conflict was contained, not solved. This containment shaped diplomacy across the Cold War. Berlin became the reference point for restraint. It demonstrated how far systems were willing to go to avoid confrontation, even at significant human cost. The city stood as evidence that peace, when defined narrowly, could coexist with prolonged division. Generations passed under this logic. Children grew up knowing the wall as a fact rather than an anomaly. Memory shifted. Stories of unity became historical rather than personal. The extraordinary became ordinary through repetition. The wall no longer shocked. It simply existed. Yet beneath this normalization, pressure accumulated. Division required constant maintenance. Surveillance, enforcement, and justification never stopped. The system was stable, but it was not effortless. Its persistence depended on continuous control and the absence of disruption. One failure could expose its fragility. Berlin thus remained a paradox. It was both frozen and unstable, fixed in structure but sensitive in meaning. Every routine action occurred under the weight of global consequence. The city existed in a state of suspended resolution, waiting without knowing for what. This waiting defined the lived experience of the Cold War more clearly than any doctrine. Not movement, but stasis. Not victory, but endurance. Berlin did not represent the future. It represented a present that refused to move forward. And as long as the wall stood, the city reminded the world that unresolved conflict does not disappear. It solidifies, reshaping lives quietly, day after day. As the Cold War moved through its later decades, Berlin remained a constant reminder of how deeply conflict could embed itself into everyday life. The city no longer represented a temporary standoff. It represented a system that had learned how to persist. Division was no longer explained as an emergency. It was justified as necessity. This justification shaped how authority presented itself. Security was framed as protection, not restriction. Control was described as order. The wall was no longer discussed primarily as a barrier, but as a stabilizing structure. Language softened the reality of separation, making it easier to tolerate and harder to challenge. For those living within this system, the cost was gradual rather than dramatic. Opportunities narrowed quietly. Choices were filtered through regulation. Futures were shaped by constraints that felt normal because they had always been there. The absence of alternatives reduced the sense of loss even as it deepened it. Despite this normalization, the wall never fully erased awareness of what lay beyond it. The proximity of the other side made division impossible to forget. Sounds carried across barriers. Lights were visible at night. The reminder was constant. Separation was enforced, not natural. This proximity created a unique psychological tension. The border was close enough to be seen but distant enough to be unreachable. Desire and frustration coexisted in the same space. Berliners lived with a daily awareness of limits measured in meters rather than miles. Internationally, the city continued to function as a pressure gauge. Any change in Berlin was interpreted as a signal of broader intent. Small adjustments carried symbolic weight. Stability required restraint not only locally, but globally. The city's fate was bound to decisions made far beyond its borders. As the Cold War began to loosen elsewhere, Berlin lagged behind. Systems that had been built to endure did not dissolve easily. The wall remained because removing it required more than agreement. It required trust, and trust had been eroded over decades. Stability had been engineered around separation. Reversal introduced uncertainty. This hesitation revealed the true cost of long-term division. The longer it lasted, the more difficult it became to undo. Structures designed to prevent conflict became obstacles to resolution. The wall, once justified as temporary, now stood as evidence of how deeply fear could shape policy. Berlin showed that conflicts managed indefinitely can outlast the reasons that created them. When stability becomes the primary goal, change becomes the risk. The city was stable, but not whole. Secure, but not free. This contradiction defined the final years of the divided city. Life continued. Systems functioned. But beneath the surface, the awareness remained that division was sustained not because it was just, but because it was familiar. And familiarity, when reinforced long enough, can be one of the most powerful forces in history. When the wall finally fell, it did not collapse because it was defeated. It collapsed because the system that sustained it could no longer justify its own permanence. The structures of control that had once promised stability began to feel heavier than the conflict they were meant to contain. What had been built to manage fear was now sustaining it. The end came quietly, almost hesitantly. There was no grand declaration that division had failed. There was simply a moment when enforcement loosened and people moved. What decades of policy, surveillance, and restraint had maintained was undone by human presence. The wall lost its authority the moment it lost its inevitability. For Berliners, the fall was not an instant return to unity. It was a confrontation with everything that had been normalized. The city did not simply reconnect streets. It re-encountered memories, absences, and identities shaped by separation. Unity required adjustment, not celebration alone. Division had left marks that concrete could hide but not erase. The world watched because Berlin had never belonged only to itself. Its division had symbolized the Cold War at its most visible. Its reunification signaled more than political change. It suggested that systems built on fear could be dismantled, but only after they exhausted their own logic. Yet the fall of the wall did not undo the lesson Berlin had taught. It revealed it more clearly. Prolonged conflict does not always end in violence. Sometimes it hardens into structure. Sometimes it becomes normal. And sometimes, when conditions finally change, it collapses not with force but with disbelief that it lasted so long. Berlin's history shows how easily emergency measures can become permanent, and how difficult they are to reverse once accepted. It demonstrates that stability achieved through separation carries costs that accumulate silently over time. The wall prevented escalation, but it also preserved division long after its necessity had passed. The Cold War did not end in Berlin because the city was healed. It ended there because the contradiction could no longer be sustained. A city divided for stability had become unstable in meaning. The wall no longer represented protection. It represented failure prolonged. Berlin remains a warning written into geography. It reminds the world that conflict does not always destroy cities. Sometimes it reshapes them, teaches them how to endure division, and calls that endurance peace. And once walls are built to manage fear, the hardest step is not constructing them. It is recognizing when they no longer serve any purpose at all.